Hello, this is Socially Triggered, and this video is a response video to NonCompete's Why Capitalism Sucks number 3. I've responded to his videos in the past, and I want to just kind of keep up with the series because he really does try to make a strong case for why capitalism sucks, and he really misses the point and doesn't really understand capitalism. So I kind of want to break down his arguments and show you why capitalism doesn't suck. It's actually quite a great system, and it's one that brings the most freedom to the workers. So let's watch his video, and I'll comment as we play it, and I hope you enjoy my commentary. Thanks.
Hello and welcome back to Why Capitalism Sucks. This is part 3 of the series, so if you're just joining us, you may want to go back and begin with part 1. There's a link in the description. Otherwise, let's
get on with it!
In our last episode, we talked about how capitalism puts workers in a state of constant conflict with the ruling class of capitalists. Now, let's talk about how capitalism puts workers in conflict with ourselves. A lot of capitalism apologists like to say that capitalism is voluntary. According to this line of thinking, workers are in a fantastic position under capitalism because we can choose to work wherever we want. If your capitalist boss is treating you poorly, or if you're not making as much money as you're worth, well, you're free to quit your job and go work somewhere else. This makes it sound like an individual worker has a lot of power and freedom to improve their situation under capitalism. So let's take a closer look at how things work according to this worldview. A worker gets a job at a factory and the work conditions are terrible. Long hours, bad pay, no opportunities for advancement, hostile managers. This job sucks. Take this job and shove it, says Glip Glop. I'm gonna quit working for you and go work for your competitor. Oh no, says the manager. What are we going to do? This factory can't function without your labor. Glip Glop applies for a new job and gets it. The new factory has higher pay and better conditions and everything works out great. Capitalism is a wonderful system since the arrangement between workers and capitalists is completely voluntary and we're all free to improve our position by changing jobs. If a company doesn't treat employees well, they'll go out of business and other companies who offer higher pay and better conditions will dominate the marketplace. Pretty great, right? Except, wait, is this really how things usually work under capitalism?
So he's going to ask a series of questions. I'm going to answer his questions before he asks them here. So he sets up a scenario about how capitalism in theory works, okay? Where he shows really the power of the worker. That the worker can say, hey, I don't like my work environment and I choose to leave. And they can choose to leave and go to some other company. Now we all know that that isn't always the case, that there's not always a company B to go to. But what he's missing, and it's a big factor that he didn't explain in this scenario, is there is a connection between that worker and the employer. Whenever you bring in a worker into any job, you have to train them for that job. And that training period, it can be, usually they say about 6 months. That worker is not really very productive during that 6 months. It's an investment that the employer makes into that employee. It doesn't matter what the job is, even McDonald's job. There is that training period. The easier the job, the shorter the training period, but usually there's a fairly extensive training period where the worker is not performing at a very productive level. And then after that period, the worker actually goes beyond what is expected of them and actually can build skills and do the work more efficiently and actually increase their value. So it's very detrimental to the company when they lose an employee that has been trained and has been put where they've given an investment of time and energy into that employee. So one of the things that is missed in this, and it's a very important element of the whole capitalist system, is that the employer has made an investment in that employee. And it's not a simple thing to just find some other person. It's not like a cog. He'll make the communist reference to a cog in the machine. Well, it's not like you can just go around and find another cog. People are not so easily interchangeable. So just be aware of this, and we'll watch more of his video.
Really voluntary? Do workers really have the freedom and ability to improve their lives under capitalism, or is this freedom merely an illusion? To answer this question, we have to look at the power dynamics between employers and workers under capitalism. In the capitalist system, jobs are distributed just like other goods and services on the free market. Workers are essentially selling their work to capitalists. This seems pretty fair on face value. You want me to work for an hour? Well, you're going to have to pay me X amount of dollars for my work. If this labor market were fair and voluntary, we would expect to see a few things. To begin with, the market would have to have so many job openings that a worker will truly have a reasonable chance to quit their job and seek better opportunities elsewhere if they're being mistreated by an employer. Furthermore, the stresses of a worker quitting should be equitably distributed between the employer and the worker. It should be just as painful for an employer to lose a worker as it is for a worker to lose a job. Otherwise, the employer will have an unfair position of leverage over the worker, since the worker would have a lot more to lose than the employer if they quit their job. This kind of balance might theoretically be achieved if the number of available jobs is approximately equal to the number of available workers. If there are 10 open jobs and 10 available workers on the market, it's conceivable that workers would have a relatively strong bargaining position when seeking employment. If this were the case, then workers would be interviewing prospective employers just as much as employers are interviewing them. Heck, if there are more jobs available than there are workers, then finding a job would be a fantastic experience. The worker could even make unreasonable demands from the employer, since they'd be a hot commodity on the job market. Now, on the other hand, if there are more job seekers on the market than there...
So just before he gets into the other points, he was suggesting that there's a case where first there could be a situation where there's more jobs than employees. Okay, that actually is the case currently in the U.S. Right now, there's about 7 million unfilled jobs in the U.S. So just so you know, this he tries to make it sound like a ridiculous situation that it's never that way, that there's more jobs than actually employees. But actually, most of the time, it is that case where it's very difficult to find that individual. And the one thing that communists never seem to understand is you're not hiring a cog, you're hiring an individual, a person that fits into your company. And that's actually a very difficult thing to do. It's very hard to find a good worker. It's not that they're easily interchangeable. So that it's one thing that they always miss in the communist thing. The communists have a tendency of seeing all people the same. They believe in equality, and equality is just an illusion. There's no equality. We're not the same. We're different, and that's what actually makes us useful. Because we're different, we're individuals. That's a good thing, because you want to have those different skills and different traits that are necessary to get those jobs done. And it's very difficult in business to find people that have those special traits that you need. So one of the things that he's setting up an argument here that really doesn't even make sense for the way employers see their employees. They don't see them as cogs, where there's 20 jobs out there and there's 30 employees. Well, we can just pick any one of those employees and they'll fit into those 20 jobs. It doesn't work that way. So because those jobs are very fine-tuned to a specific individual. So you actually either have to take somebody that doesn't fit the job and then train them and invest a lot of money and time into them, or you find that right person that fits into your company. And that's a very challenging thing to do. And I have to stress this over and over again. So he's missing the point here. So I'm going to play more of his video, and he sets up an argument that I'll have to take down too.
Fairness completely breaks down, and employers hold significant power over their workers, since the prospect of unemployment would be daunting. In this kind of environment, most unemployed workers will face a long, hard, stressful period of time without income as they're forced to compete with each other for scarcely available jobs. So it seems there are three possible power dynamic scenarios for capitalist job markets. There might be more jobs than there are job seekers, which gives workers power over employers. The amount of available jobs might be roughly equal to the amount of job seekers, which distributes power evenly between workers and employers. Or there might be more job seekers than there are jobs, which gives employers power over workers. So which of these scenarios seems most like our reality? If you've ever been on the job hunt for a long time, you know just how stressful it can be. You aren't receiving any income, the weeks drag by as you submit resumes to countless companies. When you finally do get a job interview, it causes tremendous anxiety as you must bow and scrape to impress your potential employers and convince them that you're the most competitive person for the job. Competitive. That's exactly what this system is. Under capitalism, you are in competition with your fellow workers and other job seekers to curry favor with your employer. Your employer is firmly in control of your work life, and you are forced to fight your coworkers for the favor of your employer. With this in mind, it's safe to say that most employers have tremendous power and leverage over employees under capitalism. Losing a job just sucks. Most of us dread the prospect of becoming unemployed, and most workers put up with pretty crappy jobs because the alternative prospect of unemployment is terrifying. Especially if you have to support children, or if you have a medical condition that requires expensive treatment, or you're trapped in a toxic living situation and you want to escape it.
Okay, so so you see the argument that he sets up. There's three scenarios that he suggests: that there's more jobs than employees, equal number of jobs to employees, or that there's less jobs than there are employees. So, and then he makes the case that really it's the third situation where there's more employees than jobs that really is the situation of our current society. As I said, that just isn't factually true. There's actually more jobs than employees. And it's always going to be that situation. It sounds weird, and you might not believe me, especially if you're in a job where you say, well, my job's getting phased out. All of a sudden, I'm a worker that can't find a job in my field. Well, yes, that can be the situation where you won't be able to find a job in your field. When I first started out, I had no idea what I was going to do as a living. And I tried many different jobs. But each time I tried a different job, I bring in the knowledge of the previous jobs that I had taken. So you might not be able to get the same job again, but you can always get a different job and use the knowledge that you have from previous jobs. So there may not be the same number of jobs available, but there's always more jobs than there are employees. And you would kind of understand this if you think about it this way. Every time a business opens, and if it's truly a free market, there's lots of businesses that are constantly opening and building up and failing, building up and failing. Well, in that, there's always going to be a demand for employees. And there's actually a demand between companies to fight for those for those employees, that there's actually a competition between companies for those employees. But the point is, there's always a demand for employees. And the more the market is free, the more you'll see that demand. Generally, when the market isn't very free, you'll see the actual opposite that he's describing, where you'll notice another element to whenever you hear socialists speak, they always talk about the evil capitalists having power over the workers. For communists, it's all about power. When you read the Communist Manifesto, Marx really creates this case where it's always a power struggle between two different groups, and its history is basically pushed along through various power struggles that get resolved and then create a new power struggle and so forth. And he really sees that communism is all about fixing the balance of the power struggle between capitalists and their workers. So you'll notice that power thing really plays up within this whole narrative that he's creating, that it's really the evil capitalists that are just exploiting their workers and so forth. It's a very powerful notion that they try to really instill into people, make them feel like, oh, I'm being exploited. And it's a really powerful washing tool that they use. And it's just not the case, but it's very powerful. So the point is, with all of this, he's creating a narrative that just isn't really based on reality. And it's really important to understand this. I'm trying to give you the employer's perspective. I have about 20 employees myself. That as an employer, it's very important to try to keep your workers happy. You will go out of business if you don't keep your employees happy. So it's something that's really not understood. The funny thing is, way back when, during the early part of the Industrial Revolution, everyone sort of thinks about those times as these poor exploited workers, similar to the video where he shows the glib glob or whatever his name is being exploited and being treated harshly. That was the case. But what people don't realize is that those workers that were being treated very harshly at the early stages of the Industrial Revolution came from even harsher work environments where they were basically slaves. They were serfs before that. They worked on the farm, they worked long hours, and they barely were able to survive under those circumstances. And they were treated very harshly by the nobles that basically ruled over them. And they didn't really even have control of their own land. They were just basically serfs and peasants that were treated very, very poorly. And then when they got into the factories, they were still treated harshly, very horrible working conditions. But over time, as those entrepreneurs and employers had to compete for those employees, the employers were forced to really improve the working conditions for their employees. And this is important to understand because one of the most famous capitalists of all time, Henry Ford, he really understood this. And what he did was he introduced the 40-hour work week. And the reason he introduced that was if he didn't introduce that, his workers just wouldn't perform, and he wouldn't be able to retain those workers because they would go somewhere else that would provide better working conditions. There was actually a really interesting video that I just watched, and I kind of want to talk about this video that I saw because it really kind of explains the situation with the capitalist environment. It was talking about slavery. Now, slavery, horrible. The worst possible situation you can be in is the slave situation. And what they noticed when they did research into slavery was the productivity of slaves was actually very, very low. It wasn't, even though you have somebody who basically you own, you really couldn't, squeeze them for every ounce of energy that they had. The more you abuse them, the less they would work. If you ever been on a farm and you try to work a horse too much, well, it just stops working. Well, it's the same with people. People are maybe even more non-tolerant of that kind of activity. So the point is, you can only work a worker so much. And a slave, they were saying they're basically 1/3 the value of a regular worker because they just wouldn't, you had to motivate them, you had to push them. And that in itself took a lot of energy to do because they weren't motivated because they were basically slaves. Well, if a worker is treated like a slave by the capitalist, they'll tend to do the same thing. They won't be very productive, and they will actually be a detriment to the company. So it's very important as a good capitalist to incentivize your employees to work hard. And you do that through improving the work conditions, through many different means, like good salary, so forth. So the point is that it's not so simple to, as an exploitation kind of thing. A lot of these people just don't understand it. Actually, in the same video that I was talking about the slaves, they were saying how if you looked back then, and the ones that were the most abusive to their slaves were new slave masters from the north. The southern slave masters were a little bit better to their slaves because they knew this personality trait of their slaves, that if they abused them too much, they just would get no productivity out of them. Whereas the northern slave masters were not as well versed in how to be a slave master, and they would generally, just whip them harder or treat them very poorly, expecting that would be enough to incentivize them to work harder, and it wouldn't work. So this is, I'm giving the worst circumstance as an analogy to the workers within a capitalist system. The worst circumstance. Well, capitalism is actually about setting the workers free. That they do have the choice to leave if they're not happy. They do have the choice not to work if they're not happy. The point is that capitalism is about freeing workers. And a good capitalist will generally find ways to make their workers feel happy in the work that they're doing. Because it is a free exchange between two people. At the end of the day, it's an exchange between the company and the employee. And if that exchange is on either side felt that it's not fair, then one of them might walk from that exchange. And both sides don't really want that to happen. So they basically will work to make sure that both sides are happy. So capitalism is a good system in that respect. And communists don't really get it because, as I said, they see all the workers as being the same. They see everyone as just a cog in the wheel of the machinery of the capitalist system, but they don't really understand how the whole thing works. I realize that I'm kind of rambling on a little bit, but there's some really basic things that I want people to understand about capitalism that really have to be understood. I'm going to actually play the next part of his video in a second video that I'm going to make about this topic, because there's just so much to unpack here, I should say, that I really want to address. So we'll let the video play in part 2 of his part 3, why capitalism sucks. I hope you enjoyed this video. Stay tuned to the next video. I'll release it soon after. I just want to break it up just to keep it a bit shorter and just comment on this because there's so much here that needs to be understood. So please comment on this. If you're a socialist, please debate me on it. I'd love to hear your responses. And thank you for listening.